Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the M3 Melody Market Update. My name is Melody Wright, and I like to do this show to give you updates out there on housing that you're not really getting anywhere else and put it into context. Today, I have with me John Wake. He's a colleague that I met through Twitter, ex Twitter, and he is in the Phoenix market where things are really heating up. And so we're going to talk to John today about what he's seeing because similar to the way when I was there in March of 2023, there was so much more inventory out there that I couldn't find anywhere else. We're now starting to see all of that come to market. So we want to hear from John to see what's going on there. So, welcome, John. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and about your background and how you ended up tracking real estate in Phoenix?
Okay, thank you so much, Melody. This is I'm a numbers nerd. I got a degree in agricultural economics, a master's. Then I worked for USDA in Washington D.C. and the American Embassy in Paris. And then came back home to Phoenix, and uh, I started getting into real estate in like the year 2000 ish because I needed a job, and I found out there was data that there was public records showing the actual official sales price of homes. I'm going, I didn't. What? Who knows that? I guess. So then was teaching myself how I had an email newsletter where you subscribe to your what was it, 122 zip codes in Metro Phoenix. You subscribe to your zip code, and then I would buy the data and then send it out as an email. And so that got me interested. So my goal back then was to sell advertising to real estate agents. So I had to meet some real estate agents, but I wasn't making any money. And then everybody wanted me to show them homes. Like, you moron, get a real estate license, show them the homes yourself. So I did that. So I was doing basically a Zillow thing 5 years before Zillow or years before Zillow. But then when the boom took off, I had a front row seat to that boom and that bust. But by the time the bust was over and I got time again to work on the websites and stuff, it was way too stale by then. But so that became, as an economist, I'm trying to figure out what's going on in this market all the time, trying to understand the real estate market. It's a game. Like what my sons would play a computer game. My computer game is trying to figure out what the heck is going on with the real estate market. How do you
Yes.
explain this stuff? And so finally, I'm getting old enough for this. I decided last a couple of years ago, it's like, hey, you're getting old. You got to come to conclusions on this stuff. So I wrote up something for my website, Real Estate Decoded, a thing called 76 Secrets of U.S. Home Ownership. So I just sort of like combined all that stuff and put it into one place. So that's where I am, and I'm still following it closely in the Phoenix market. But I tend to lean towards being cautious. I'm a numbers guy. When I was selling, like half my clients were engineers. That was my client base.
And I'm an engineer, John, and I'm a numbers person as well. So I think that's why I appreciate your work. Recently you were featured in a local TV spot. Tell us what you're seeing there.
Yeah, the story about the inventory is becoming a common story. So the inventory here is really interesting because this usually it falls during the high season. Here it begins in January, usually falls during January, but it's been increasing during January. And in fact, we just hit a week ago, the highest level of the number of homes for sale since 2011.
Mhm.
It's a lot. I mean, when it's not adjusted for a population, but nevertheless, we have a large number of homes for sale. Now, prices were pretty cool. They were pretty flattish, like very flattish for like 18 months, super flattish. But then we did see just numbers I just pulled yesterday for last month. April was down. The median home price was down $19,000. That's
What?
19,000. That's using MLS data for single
Ooh.
family homes, median home price 19,000, and that's in April. In April, usually the prices go up. They don't go down in April.
Right.
It's only 1 month, but that's not a good sign at all when it moves against the seasonality.
Oh, so let's spend some time on that, John, because that is something I am religious about tracking is the seasonality, because that's going to be your indicator, right? When you are acting in contradiction or in against something that happens every year forever, right? Because we have a very ingrained season in these markets. Like in Florida, we know that that's a difference. It's actually October to April. That's their high season. And right now we're starting to see inventory slow there, except for in Tampa and Orlando. But that's what we would expect. Now we're still at inventory levels that we wouldn't expect right now with the selling season coming to an end. But tell us about that Phoenix market, particularly. I know you guys get a lot of snowbirds down there. What is your typical high season? And then repeat what you said about how we're acting, in contradiction to what we would typically see during this time.
Yeah, typically prices are weak in the fall, and then our high season starts. I mean, it's like turning on a faucet between Christmas and New Year's. The number of people searching websites for homes, and then they're searching. They start going under contract in January. They start closing in February, and then it goes through May, and a good year through June. So we're in the high season right now, and I learned this lesson like 20 years ago. When something moves against this normal seasonality, that takes a lot of pressure. It takes a lot of something to make it move against seasonality, because seasonality is such a strong force. So um, I was looking at it. It looks like the main reason is not because sales are down. Sales are almost January through now are almost identical to last year and almost identical to the year before that. The difference is the number of homes hitting the market.
Right.
So the
Right.
supply of homes for sale is what's increasing and putting downward pressure on prices. So
Right.
it's kind of hard to figure out what that is, who's putting it up for sale. I, I did a little research yesterday. It's kind of hmm, just a beginning research, but it looks like second home sellers and renters tend to be a little bit more, not huge, but just a little bit more. But as time goes on, if that happens over months and months, it starts the
Accumulate.
inventory starts building up, because that's
Mhm.
been going on since January. Now, the other thing, the prices could have come down so much in 1 month could have been the mix of homes
Sure.
between less luxury and more just normal size homes.
Right.
So there's a little bit of that, but it's not huge. I think that could be, well, that is part of it, but I think there's also just prices are coming down to some degree, because there was a, like, for example, compared to a year ago, the larger homes, say 2,000 to 4,000 square feet is what I was looking at as being larger, that they were about the same as last April. But the smaller homes, 1,000 to 2,000 square feet, was up a little bit, not huge, like 10% or something. So
Mhm.
it's not the luxury people are selling less or about the same, but the lower ones, the less expensive ones, are getting out more than they have.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit of the fall is a change in the mix of homes that are selling.
Well, and let's talk about this for a second because I think 2024 was so fascinating. I think you observed exactly what I did. I saw it in the national data and all the cities that I tracked that we were actually on a downward trajectory for home prices. In 2023, and then after the bank failures, the
Hmm.
intervention with the BTFP, you can see a bounce across the country as in housing prices as well as labor. But what that was is that those that could transact were transacting at that higher price. And then the first time home buyers we know were left out of the market. It was like the smallest amount of first time home buying they'd ever saw. And what happened is the administration put in these very aggressive FHA loss mitigation programs that meant your lower end of the market did not have to transact, right? If they got behind in their mortgage, they didn't have to list it. They could go repeatedly to the till and get a workout over and over again, and save from having to sell their home, or even go into foreclosure. Essentially, the Wall Street Journal article said there were 9 FHA loans that went to foreclosure last year and 500,000 workouts. 500,000. And so, what we've recently learned is that this administration has put a kibosh on that program. It will be ended at the end of September. And they also included another highlight, which is, and get ready for this, John, because no one is understanding this. I'm putting it in my Substack today. If you are behind on your student loans, you will not be eligible for an FHA workout.
Whoa.
So those 9 million people,
Whoa.
that are behind in their student loans. And by the way, in 2021, and I'm sure it's more now, FHA said that 45% of its borrowers had student loans. They are, and student loans are about 20%
40.
delinquent right now.
Whoa.
They just
45%.
Yeah, they have student loans. It doesn't mean that they're delinquent, but we know that the default rate on those student loans are about 21% overall. So we can imagine that the 45% of borrowers that do have FHA loans, 20% of them are going to have delinquent student loans and won't be eligible for a workout, meaning they're going to have no option. Now, a lot of people, and this is what a lot of folks don't know, John, is a lot of people have already used all their options. And so, what I had said at the beginning of the year, and I'm sticking to it, is that 2025, 2024 was just like a pause on everything. It felt like, what's going to happen in the election, all this loss mitigation, hope around rate cuts, hope around the results of the election. But 2025 is the year of movement, and its motivation is turning to distress. And so I think we did have a lot of motivated second home selling last year and investment selling. And I think this year, the who's going to dominate the narrative are those on the lower end of the tier because they cannot afford to wait anymore. And those life decisions, death, divorce, default, and the DOD, who moves people every year, is going to force that lower end to transact this year, pulling down home prices. But as you say, that's only one component. I mean, there's several factors, one of which we just know affordability is, I mean, is completely absent. So, what do you think about, what I don't know if you've ever looked into what you think the FHA percentage is in your market. I haven't. I probably need to look that up and see.
I
But I
assume it's
bet there's.
I
Sorry,
assume
go
it's
ahead.
normalish. But so that you're just saying the demand from FHA is gonna really fall
Oh,
off
yeah.
in the
Oh,
fall.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and people say, "Well, FHA is such a small part of the market." No, it used to be a small part of the market. It's now 13 to 15% of your outstanding mortgages. So this is no small, and a lot of the investors use the FHA because they could lie on those applications
Oh,
and only put 3.5% down. So that made a lot of sense for them,
so
right?
that was mortgage fraud because FHA, their rules don't allow for investors, right? Unless they're living in
Yeah, it's so they has to
triplex or
be owner occupied. I think they did come up with some second lien product, but nobody takes it. Like they just lie on their application. I've seen it in my books already, in my client books. And because they have those favorable terms and they can have low credit scores. And I think there are probably operations of these short-term rental Airbnb bros out there that have created like rings of FHA lending because they know you don't have to pay it back. Like one of the interviews I did of Mark McDonough, he's been in the industry 30 years. He went into the FHA Neighborhood Watch, which you can go in and search lenders in there. And he saw that there were certain lenders who had a 50% early payment default rate. That's unheard of, and that means the payment defaulted within the first 6 months to a year of origination. So if a lender has that high of a default rate, they are coaching their clients that you really never have to pay this loan, or they are in on it, if you know what I mean.
oh yeah.
So the Philly Fed did a paper in January 23 and said, we know that mortgage fraud did not stop after the GFC. And in fact, when investors are involved, you can typically assume 1 in 3 investor loans are going to be fraud. And so I think that, this
One in
is the,
three.
yeah, of investor loans. And so the thing is, I think what most are missing because the narrative has been so strong, is that this market really since 2000 has been about investors and not people looking for a home.
Agreed.
Tell us a little bit about, what do you see out there? What do you hear? Go ahead.
Well, let me ask you a question. On the FHA thing, you were talking about the foreclosures are gonna be increasing. So play that out because one of the things I saw in 2000 in the great real estate bust and the Great Recession was it was set up, and I think this is one thing that's different this time. It was set up, it seemed like the servicers were incentivized to foreclose as fast as possible. Like that was very different than in SNL because I heard stories of SNL would like foreclose and just rent it out for you because they didn't want to because they didn't want to drive down the market even worse than it was. But it seemed like they were foreclosing so fast during the great GFC that. But now this time I'm thinking, oh, the government's going to step in. They've been so involved in everything, they won't allow those foreclosures to hit the market and drive down prices the way they did. Because that's what really prices were falling a little bit, but then when you started went over a cliff once the foreclosures hit, because they were selling it at way below market and it just drove everything down so fast.
Yeah, the GSC is like Fannie Freddie. They do this thing to the servicers. I mean, it's so crazy. As a mortgage servicer, you sit in a world of contradiction, and you have the regulators saying you can't foreclose. You have the agencies saying you have to foreclose and penalizing you if you don't do it quickly. You then have the state, you'll have the attorney general step in, put pauses or moratoriums on. But essentially, John, you may not know this, but as a mortgage servicer, you have certain timelines you have to follow in each of these states. And if you don't, you get penalized with repurchase requests. You have to repurchase the whole loan, or you could get compensatory fees, or you could not get your full claim back from these timeline delays. So essentially, the servicer has to move. And I remember Fannie and Freddie threatening us that if we did not move our seriously delinquent population,
Whoa.
they were going to pull servicing from us, which is their contractual right, which
Whoa.
would have tanked the bankruptcy auction. So my company was going into bankruptcy at the time. So yes, so there's immense pressure. But what happened with the last administration through COVID, all of that, all of the agencies were kind of told, slow your roll. Let's get out all of these really aggressive loss mitigation programs. And this is why we've had no foreclosures. Or, John, we would have had a ton of foreclosures. I mean, the amount of workouts that were completed during COVID, and I mean, COVID, that was 5 years ago, and that FHA program's still going on. And they just came out with a HUD loan performance report, and the FHA is over 12% delinquent. I mean, this is just insanity.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so, we are completely deluded about the state of the consumer right now, and a big part of that as well, these credit scores, because of the student loans becoming due, are going to be very impactful in terms of turning off credit, for a lot of these people that are already in distress. And so I think very quickly people are going to realize we're in a much dire picture. So to your question, absolutely, when foreclosures start to hit, I mean, I saw an example in one of my client books yesterday. Sell set for June. What So a lot of people may not know this, and I know this is your interview, so sorry, audience, but I'm
No,
just going to tell you a quick. Um, so what the agencies
please.
make you do is bid total debt. Okay, so the servicer has to show up with a total debt bid, but that's all they have to do. So on this home, what a lot of investors were doing were taking out very low balance loans on these properties and then refining and buying more and more and more of them. So this one is going to go to sell with total debt at 99,000. And the appraisal on the home is right now 400,000. And so you can see how quickly once these things start to hit, because all the bank has, so all the servicer has to do is my opening bid is 99,000. So if anybody wants to come in and bid between that 99,000 and that appraised price, that's going to be more proceeds for the servicer, but you're only bidding their total debt. And so very quickly you could have a situation where you've got a $400,000 home being sold for $100,000 at the auction. So that could very quickly impact home prices once we see these foreclosures go to sell. And we know VA was on a moratorium up until December. So we're definitely going to start to see these things hit. I'm seeing it in client books. So yes, that's absolutely going to have an impact on prices. We probably won't get a huge amount of foreclosures till June of next year, I would say,
Okay, there
but
we go.
Yeah, but
That was my
we're
next question. When does it start hitting the
well, we're gonna see another big round of delinquency in June of this year, in my opinion. We saw it in 23, 24. Delinquency is very seasonal as well, because essentially you get that bonus payout in March or you get that tax refund between January and April, and you can get caught up on your bills. But by the time June hits, people start to kind of struggle again. And then delinquency always kind of peaks in December, that Christmas kind of time frame. So we're about to see delinquencies increase, and it's going to be in a way that I think people aren't going to be able to say we have low delinquency anymore. And in fact, Black Knight never shows going back to, 2005, 2007, but we just hit foreclosure numbers that match from a, absolute level as well as a percentage level of where we were in January of 2007.
what?
So, yeah, so we're on our way. That's right.
Oh, that's scary.
Well, it's, gradually then suddenly, right, John? I
Yeah.
mean, this is but yes, this will absolutely impact home prices.
Okay, so we're
And
just next fall, we'll start seeing demand fall because of FHA, and then next a year in June, the following summer, we start seeing distressed sales hitting the market. To me, I think distressed sales were what killed.
yeah, I think we're gonna see distressed sales sooner than that, but we'll see a material kind of, a much more material group of them next year. But they're starting this year, and I'm seeing it already. And so it just, how this goes. It's it's like the same, the same, the same, and then you have a month where you have a $19,000 price drop in the high season, and you're looking around going, "Oh, wait, what
What's going
just?"
on here? Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So I think the distress is coming. Have you been surprised by the amount of inventory that you're seeing?
Yeah, I expected it to be falling as it normally does during the high season, and it's still creeping up. Since
Mhm,
and it's the highest since 2011. What the heck?
right.
That's a bad sign, and it's not because of sales. It's because people have decided to finally. It's not to sell to put their home on the market. So it's supply. Everybody was talking about supply, supply, supply. Well,
Mhm,
now the problem is too much supply for
right,
sale, and
right.
that's what's driving down prices.
So, when you think about all this supply, what do you think? And I know you talked about the second home investment and kind of on the lower end, but just generally speaking, what do you hear from people in Phoenix about why people want to move there, why they want to stay? What are the pros for Phoenix? And then maybe list some of the cons.
Oh, it's funny. It used to be a big reason people moved to Phoenix was because homes were cheap. You have to have a memory, but that was a big reason people from California. So most of the people who come here more than the other states from California. So they're close. They still can drive to visit their relatives back in California. So that was a lot of it. Traditionally, we had a lot of people coming from Chicago. That was been going on since the 1950s. They would New Yorkers went to Florida. Chicago people tended to come here. So that, but the economy is doing great. We had this new what is it, chip plant that
Yeah.
related to the what was it called? Anyway,
Yeah, TMSC. It's
yeah,
the
that's
yeah.
it. The
Mhm.
Taiwan
Yeah, I went
semiconductor.
out there. Yeah.
So that's and they're still going to be building that for years. It's not going to be. They started to manufacture, but they're going to be building for a few more years before they get to the full size. This is going to be world class. So there's a lot of that.
Mhm.
Um, I did see what I can't quite understand is Intel, which has a manufacturing plant here, laid off a bunch of people. So I don't
Yes.
understand what's going on there. But generally, the economy has been good. But one of our big advantages in the past was low housing, which isn't an advantage. Well, that'd be like Texas as well. It used to be an advantage in Texas, not so much anymore. But nevertheless, it's the trend is so strong. I don't see it leveling off. There was one point though when during the real estate bust, so I don't know what, 2011 or something like that, where the population in Phoenix fell a little bit
Yeah.
because there was so much construction was gone. A lot of those people in the construction industry just left.
And I think you guys might see that again, right? As well as I don't know if you've looked at kind of what contribution foreign born made to your population increases last year. I mean, that was for the majority of the country, the only population increases we saw were through immigration. So that might be interesting for what's going on in Phoenix. But do those Californians they stay happy, they stay there, generally speaking? Because I think a lot of them that went to Texas, some of them had to go back. They didn't like it very much.
Yeah, they generally stay here, and also Washington State comes down here, so that's yeah, they tend to stay. We do have
Yeah,
a we do have an income tax. The state does. It's a flat tax of like 2.5%. But then our property taxes are low. In fact, that started like in the 1950s when we were trying to get people to move from Chicago to Phoenix. They intentionally kept low property taxes to bring people in, and it worked.
and that's
Like when
smart.
we used to sell
Yeah,
real estate, if somebody asked me, "What are the property taxes like?" They're like, "Oh, they're not from Arizona," because
right.
Arizonans never ask that question. But if
Yeah,
they're from back east, they would ask.
yes. So what are you hearing? We've definitely seen insurance rise across the country, even in states not on the coast are, kind of what we would consider really prone to things like hurricanes, earthquakes, fires. In the middle of the country, we've seen a lot of insurance increase because of tornadoes and bad weather. What's the insurance situation like in Arizona?
It's gone up, but I don't have the exact number, but it
Sure.
has gone up. And I think part of that is the insurance company lost a ton on Pacific Palisades or wherever. And so they're trying
Mhm.
to make it up on the rest of their
Book.
client base. So
Right.
that's part of it. Even though you weren't hit by a fire or an earthquake or a hurricane, it can affect you.
Yeah, it's the other thing I always think about, especially when I drove out there in March of 23, John and I spent a whole bunch of time all over Phoenix, all over the perimeter, all over downtown, all like in far flung, areas. And then I already saw out on the west side, some abandoned, build sites. That was already happening in 23.
Wow.
I think some of those probably got a new injection and I saw it in the permits, once BTFP and everybody was like, "Oh, it's all gonna be fine. They're gonna save us again." But I definitely could already see signs of overbuilding. So, you know, we've got the property insurance situation is better. Property taxes are lower. That's great. But what about the water situation? Because
Oh,
when I was out there, and this is what I was trying to say, and I lost my train of thought for a second, which is probably obvious. But there was a suburb that I passed where they had to shut down they already had almost 300 homes and they were fully almost built and they had to shut it down because they did not have the groundwater. And this was kind of it was outside the city, closer, like on your way to Vegas kind of thing. But what is the water situation there, or what have you heard most recently?
well, there was a big change. It was a Democratic governor che- changed the policy. There's a groundwater law passed in like 1980. So they got active management areas, which are certain areas that have special laws for water use, and Metro Phoenix is the big one. So they said you need to have 100-year supply of water before you can build and get a building permit. So what they did is they changed the law saying a lot of these farms, they're farming, they're using water now, do not have a 100-year supply. So they cannot build on those areas. And a lot of it was on the West Valley. So
Mhm,
that, oh my God, can you imagine what that does to the value of your farmland? Holy mackerel.
mhm,
Now you can't get building permits. That's still in the news. They're still talking
right,
about, but they haven't changed that. So that limited it. Now, but the more than half of the water used in Arizona is still used by farming. So
right,
there's still a lot of water use. And the per capita use in the city of Phoenix is like the same or oh, not per capita. I think the total water use in the city of Phoenix is like the same as it was 30 years ago because they are slowly
right.
getting rid of lawns in front and putting in desert landscape and things like that. So it is improving, but so it's less of a problem than it used to be. And we do the good part is we do have all that agricultural land, that agricultural water
Mhm,
which could be used. But on the other hand, that land when it's a well, you're basically mining the water. It's not
mhm.
going to be replaced after it's all pumped out,
Right,
and
right,
or very little. So that is a big issue for development is the water situation, and it's
right.
already affecting some places.
Well, and I know you need a lot of it for those microchip plants, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
a lot of
I
it.
I think they talked about that and they said, "We're recycling everything we use," and so they have a huge facility to recycle water and reuse
Right,
it.
right.
At least that's their talking point.
That's the talking point, right? And, that's the other thing that worries me about a lot of these big projects, and, I went out to that one specifically, is they often promise a lot of jobs and a lot of, and then when they get there, the jobs aren't there. If they get there, like, for instance, take Raleigh, where the Apple was supposed to build its second headquarters. That spurred a ton of building out there. That project has been put on hold.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's likely never going to happen, John. But you had an entire city think that Apple was coming, and they tore up surrounding cities, these old little southern towns. I mean, what I saw there was really disgusting. But the point is, you get a lot of hype around one of these projects, which takes years, by the way. And then we know with this plant specifically, they couldn't find the labor; they had to bring it in from Taiwan. Most recently, that kind of expert labor. And so I think one thing that concerns me is how many jobs is this plant really going to bring?
Mhm.
And is it going to be enough? Like to your point about with Intel, I mean, one thing that's happening, I think, in these microchip companies and these people that are getting big into these thinking they need more computing power than they really needed for these for AI. And so there's a lot of stuff going on, I think, in the AI bubble that could impact some of these projects that a lot of folks aren't really talking about in mainstream media, but those of us on FinTwit are following ever since kind of the deep seek revelations about different ways you could save processing power. So, certain chips aren't going to be needed anymore. Are some chips, there won't be as many needed as what we thought. And so I think there's a lot of headwinds coming in that space as well. But what other industries do you see largely in the area? What would you say the next biggest industries are?
There used to be a lot of higher tech kind of stuff. So that's and then a lot like talking about the retirement people moving here to retire. So they're bringing their money from back east and spending it here. So that helps the economy. So if that changed and people weren't moving here, that that hurts. And I did think you talked about Taiwan. I did see that I think they were having trouble hiring people, like you just
Yes.
mentioned. So they were bringing people in from Taiwan.
Yes.
But then again, they need houses, so that doesn't affect the housing
That's true,
market.
that's true. If you watch the documentary, they often live many to a house,
Oh yeah,
so, but yeah, that's true, absolutely. Don't get me wrong, they will definitely need housing, and there's plenty of it, as we know, in Phoenix, including the multifamily, which is, a little out of control.
one thing that is a better advantage now versus 20 years ago is the amount of employment is in housing construction is like the economy's grown so much that it's like half of what it used to be. So
Oh,
that's
that's
one of the
great.
reasons why we got so devastated by the Great Recession is because of all that housing construction was gone. Now,
Right.
even if that happens, it's not going to have as big as an impact because the economy is more
To the
diversified than it was
economy.
then. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. And speaking like, before we move on to multifamily, because I wanna talk about that a little bit, but let's just talk about the retirees. What is healthcare like out there? Because what I have in my travels all over the country, where they think they're gonna get right retirees, they don't have great infrastructure and they don't have great healthcare. And, like, for instance, in Florida, you'll talk to retirees that have to travel out of the state to get, special procedures and things like that, which there's a long, complicated reason for that. But but that's the state of things. What's it like, there in, Phoenix?
I think it's generally good because people don't understand in Arizona where there's water, there's a ton of people, and where there's no water, there's nobody. So
Right.
it's really dense,
Yeah.
essentially, in a way. I remember I went to the University of Florida for my master's degree. I remember driving around in the middle of nowhere in North Florida, and there's houses everywhere. It's like this is not like Arizona. In Arizona,
Right.
you're in the middle of nowhere, there's nothing because
Right.
so that's part of it is there. If you're in Phoenix or Tucson, there's going to be really good healthcare. And I think one of the reasons people don't move out to the smaller towns is because it's a long drive to get to a great hospital.
Right.
So that's
Right.
preventing them from developing their retirement communities outside of the metro areas.
Right. Right. And I think that's just so important and the infrastructure is so important. And I gotta tell you, John, what I noticed though when I was in Phoenix, especially, going out to places like Surprise and that area, I'm like, what's up with the roads, John? Like, why are these giant potholes everywhere all over
Oh,
the roads?
I, I don't know.
I
I
mean,
don't know. I don't know what that. Yeah. Wow. I don't know what the story behind that is.
Because honestly, I was like, "Am I in a third world country?" Like, and I would go out to some of these places, like, especially out to Surprise, and you had one road in. I mean, it was 2 lane already, the construction trucks were I mean, if ever they got as many people out there as they built for, you would never be able to leave your home. And so, I mean, that's the other thing that just upsets me about all this is, like, people just they threw homes up next to feeder lots, they threw homes up everywhere without thinking about that infrastructure. And, if I'm a retiree, I'm going to want to have access. So,
Yeah.
um, it's kind of wild. But what do you think generally about your infrastructure around there?
Well, I'm on the east side, so I don't notice it so much. And I live in Scottsdale, so it was built up.
Oh yeah, you
My
live in a pretty
subdivision was
place.
built in the
Yes.
70s, and
Yeah.
so it's okay.
Yeah, a lot more new out there and Sky. Yeah, and I mean, and very nice shops and things like that. But man, that little drive to Surprise, I it was quite the surprise, let me put it that way, and
Oh my gosh.
I
Yeah.
had a rental car that I thought I was gonna have to pay for
Oh
by
my
the end of
gosh.
it because it was so low to the ground, and I was like and I had to drive that thing to Vegas on that little road. Anyway, it was kinda crazy, but, I was just very surprised at how bad the roads were. I was just like, "That's wild."
Well,
Um,
that's the area that was getting hit by the not having enough water, 100-year supply of water.
yeah,
To
yeah.
I think of that as being on the west side and then south of Metro Phoenix and Pinal County.
So, in terms of your market, why don't you just tell us the things that people should be before we do that, like,
Mhm.
let's talk about multifamily. And I don't know if you've seen like what I've seen in Phoenix with just all of the multifamily under construction and they continue to build it. In fact, I think someone told me they just saw multifamily permits go up again in Phoenix. Do you have any thoughts on that market?
I just give you my just driving around view. I don't follow multifamily that closely, but holy mackerel, there's everywhere. And you can tell the year it was built by how many stories it is. So now it used to 5 stories is very common. In a few years it was 4. And what in the 19 what 60s they were all single story apartment complex. Anyway, see they're so dense now. And I assume it's like they're are luxury or they hope to be
They
luxury
say
or
luxury, yeah.
they
Mhm.
have really high prices, but I don't follow it that closely, but I just driving around, it's like, wow, there's a tremendous amount of multifamily.
Yeah. I think that that's enough, John. Like, I think our eyes are good, if you know what I mean, because it's too much. I mean, I do follow the numbers, but it's far too much, and they just keep swinging the hammers. And if depending on, we know what demographics look like in the rest of the country. We know that we're not even birthing babies at replacement rate. It's at 1.6. We need 2.1 to have replacement. And we also know that between 2025 and 2035, 15.6 million boomers are going to leave us. Between 2025 and 2050, I'm sorry, 2035 and 2050, that's 23 million. So I would imagine an area like Phoenix, which has a very large share of those retirees and over 65 is could be impacted by those demographic shifts. What do you think about that?
Well, generally, just looking at Phoenix, people think there's a lot of retired people, and it's an important part of the economy. But generally, we, when I looked at these numbers in the past, we tended to have a lower average age than the rest of the country because people move when they're younger. They tend not to
Yeah,
move when they're older. So if they're going to move for a job, they tend to be in their 20s or 30s rather than the 50s and 60s. But then people retire. So that's I with the demographics is kind of scary. We had that tailwind for prices because there was just more people hitting first time home buyer age.
right.
And now I think what is it for the next 10 or 15 years, there's going to be fewer and fewer. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not a huge amount, but it's going down instead of going up. That's a big change right there.
So if I could, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you're kind of bullish on Phoenix, but not necessarily home prices.
Yeah.
And then yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Prices are just disconnected from reality when you compare them to, price to income, for
That's
example.
right.
That's a really good one. And over the long term, that tends to be, when you look at decades, that tends to be a good measure. And we're way out of line just looking at that.
Yeah, it's so funny. I there's something about because I'm a data nerd too, right, John? And as I got started,
Yes.
I would yes, I know. Long live data nerds. Um, I got started and there would be things that I could, I would test and be like, yep, they're right. I can trust this source and looking at those, home price to income. But there's something about pulling that data yourself and looking at it and being like, "Oh my gosh, like this is so far beyond, reasonableness that there's no way we can sustain unless." And I'm all for this, and this is what people don't understand. If we suddenly get a whole bunch of jobs, high paying jobs that make it possible to afford these home prices, I'm okay with them there. I don't think it's going to be good for anybody at this level because they can't afford it. But that's not happening right now. In fact, we're seeing layoffs increase. You just mentioned Intel. Microsoft just announced a 3% global layoff. Like layoffs are increasing. The jobs aren't coming right now. They might come in the future. And so home prices have to correct, in my opinion. I mean, just because we have reached these unsustainable levels of, median price to median income.
Yeah, to me, the best case scenario is prices only fall 10%, 15%, and then they're flat for a decade.
Right,
Nominal prices. So the real prices
right,
is slowly going down and people can
right,
adjust. To me,
right.
that's the best case scenario. But what we had, when you look at, there was a little boom and bust in the late 70s, early 80s, and prices fell like 10%. In the S&L, they corrected like 10, 15%. And then in the Great Recession, they fell like 30, 35%.
Yeah,
Real.
yeah,
So that's a bad trend.
yeah.
I just don't think that the government would allow it since they're so much more involved now than they were then. But then again, what do you do with the people who are my kids? To
Right,
buy a home, what
right,
the you, which is worse? Prices go up or the prices go down?
right.
That's um, I
I think for our younger Americans, what's worse is if they go up, if they
yeah
stay at this level. And I think this is where, I got to tell you, John, I was simply shocked to see the administration shut that loss mitigation program down
yes
early. And I was shocked to see some of these other closures of these other little programs, down payment assistance, other things, shutting down lending to non-permanent residents, and that was controversial. They also shut down the VA loss mitigation program, and those guys have nothing. They don't have anything. If FHA still has programs after this one, but VA, that's going to be forced distress. So I absolutely believe that they will step in when it gets bad enough, but at this point, it looks like they're going to let it get bad enough, and they're not going to interfere. Now that could change, and we'll talk about that when it does. But all signs right now, and even Pulte is talking about calling in loans,
oh
dealing with it, because there's all this investment, those subject to mortgages. I'm sure you've heard about those where they go and contact somebody who's in default and they say, hey, we'll pay your mortgage for you. We'll pay the servicer. We're looking for someone to buy your house. When we find the investor to buy your house, we're going to give you an equity sweetener, and then you're going to go find another place to live. Well, that went on steroids, and in your mortgage, there's a due on sale clause that if you sell your sell your home, your mortgage is fully due and owing. That note is fully due and owing. And so a lot of this, there's a huge group of investors out there doing this and scamming folks, and unfortunately, the borrowers will be the ones left on the hook because they're the ones still on the note. And so he's talking about calling those loans. And so there's all kinds of stuff going on. But right now, the administration is not signaling they're going to come in and save these borrowers. And by the way, there's a lot of anger, I think, out there around some of these programs. People understand that they were not able to buy homes because of these overly generous loss mitigation programs. But I'm like you, when it gets bad enough, they'll probably step in. And I feel that about student loans too. I mean, effectively, collecting on these 5 million defaulted borrowers, or even these, you know, uh, so in total, there's 9 million delinquent. That's 9 million people that are going to have to be deploying their money elsewhere when they were out in the economy, going out to eat, buying things. So that this is going to have a massive hit that I think we'll start to feel, in Q4. And so I wouldn't be surprised if the administration has to do something, even though that seems implausible now. I think it's going to get realistic just because of the distress. But they're staying out of it right now.
You mentioned that those scammers, the Arizona Attorney General just came down on a bunch of scammers doing that, where they go to people who are behind
Yes.
and they have names like it sounds like a charity, like they're so it's really this
Oh, community development corps
yeah,
are
stuff like that,
yes. Yes.
and they're just scamming them. Oh my god, that's so
Yes.
sad because they end up losing the house and
That's
all the
right.
equity they had, and oh my god.
And that's this is so I've been talking about these private notes and all of this private lending in the shadows, and I have a firm belief that this is going to be one of the themes that everybody missed of what was happening, very similar to back during the 80s, seller financing. All of this went on steroids when people could not qualify or did not want to take on, these high interest rate loans. But I hear it all the time, these more wealthy sellers are like, "Well, he's good for it. He makes a lot of money. He's over leveraged, but I'll finance this note for him." And then, so I was recently, John, this is going to surprise you. I was at a private note conference in Nashville. It was my second year to go and talk to these guys are like the good guys of that market. They really do want to do things right and help everybody. But one of the servicers there told me that his seller financing deals book that he has, because he, by the way, does not service those risky subject to loans. This is just normal seller financing, is 17% delinquent right now. So just think what that's doing to private individuals who, you know, sold their house, thought it was good, was getting payments, and they're now in default and have to take those loans to foreclosure. That's just expenses none of these sellers thought they were going to have to deal with. 17%.
Oh my god. T- Talk about solutions. My hobby horse is, and I know you're talking about how it's all the financialization and the investor. To me, as solution, and the transition would be tough, but the solution is to get rid of all these tax breaks that
Mhm.
investors get in single family homes and condos because they're enormous tax breaks. Like if you, most people don't get a mortgage interest deduction on their home they live in unless
Right.
unless they make enough money that they're, but every investor does. And then
Right.
they get deduction, the depreciation deduction, even though it goes up $100,000 in value. Oh, well, we'll let you depreciate this part of the house, but we won't affect the land or the whole. We won't look at the whole house for you. We'll just look at this one thing. And then people, this is never talked about much, but in the 2020, boom was bonus depreciation was still
Mhm.
in effect. So what that meant was you could invest in a house and probably you're making money, you're paying cash and paying zero taxes for several years because of bonus depreciation. So buy another house. So that the other thing is when homeowners buy, they buy one house to live in, or investors come in, they can buy several houses. So the boom and bust is just so much more when they have all these tax breaks, and there's 1031 exchange, which is totally stupid. And that there's a bunch. There's just
Yeah,
buried all sorts of tax breaks, which basically the government's paying investors to buy single family homes away from people who would live in the home. And but that's not, but politicians, this is never caught on because politicians like, we give out tax breaks. I'm a politician. I don't take away
right,
tax breaks. And somehow it
right,
doesn't, in their mindset of removing tax breaks, even if you're going to remove it for future purchases, maybe pay the tax rate bigger for people who own the house now, but it ends on January 1 or whatever. And then over like a decade or something, it would really stabilize home prices on the upside and the downside. Um, and that would be so easy because then you don't need to have a genius to administer it. Once it's gone, it's gone. It's like if you have a lot of other ones like mortgage stuff, you have to like make these changes, and some people will make the wrong change. Like the Fed will keep rates too high or too low, or whatever. They
right.
make mistakes. But when you just get rid of the tax breaks, that just stabilizes everything. Well, right now we're kind of, I like the being in agriculture. I think of like, sure, these tax breaks work great on a lot of things, but it's like nitrogen fertilizer. It works great on a lot of crops, but on other crops, you're just feeding the weeds if you put on nitrogen
Right.
fertilizer. So I'm not saying landlords are weeds, but nevertheless, that's not what you want.
Well, I'll call those
If that's
investors
not what you want. But then you
I'll
got to
I'll
remember
call them
not.
weeds. I'll call them weeds, John, those
Okay.
investors. I
Okay.
mean, you look at these maps, like, you look at the maps and you overlay long-term rental with listings for sale, with Airbnb, and these look like disease maps. I mean, they look like, a disease has spread, and that is what it is. I mean, it is infestation of speculation, and so I think you are completely right. Like, if we just address those tax issues, we would change a lot of the incentives here, that
At
have
no
really
cost.
led us astray
At
at
zero
no
cost.
cost, right? Except for votes to our politicians, right?
Yeah. Because they
But
get
that
votes by giving out tax breaks.
yeah, yeah. So, I
But
mean,
that
I think
but you talk about the spreading of the disease. Since I was in the middle of it, I during 2005 and 6, so many of the investors, I had a lot of investor clients from California because I had a lot of internet presence. So they would find me, and what there was a ton of them. They would buy new homes, and then once it was completed, they would sell it.
yeah,
So and then maybe hold on to it for a year empty and then sell it. And they would I heard so many. They tended to be young guys in their 30s, young, and then they went into Vegas, and then they thought Vegas was done, and then Phoenix was the new market. So they were all
mhm,
coming to Phoenix and it was a contagion. It was contagion that
and that
spread
yeah,
the
and that
speculation, and that's why Phoenix got caught up in it.
and that's happened again. I mean, you can go out so to some of those subdivisions out, I was telling you about on the east side, you can go in a brand new build, uh, subdivision, and you can see for rent signs. Meaning they bought the home to rent it out. They bought the home to rent it out. So they bought a new build when they couldn't find a single family home, they bought a new build to rent it out. And then on top of that, you have people like American Home for Rent come in and do all of this built for rent. Like they specifically built entire subdivisions. I just saw one when I was in Nashville, just to rent out. And then what happened with some of those guys is when they couldn't rent them, they sold them. And what's crazy about that is, let's say, and then what you're also saying is the builders are selling whole
Yeah,
subdivisions to these rental operators. And so you might have just been the first home in that subdivision, thought you were going to be joined by other people buying their homes. Instead, you're suddenly surrounded by, people renting, which that just changes the entire makeup of the neighborhood. So, I mean, there's so much of this going on, John, that was so similar to last time. In fact, I feel like essentially we've just got the new 30-year-olds trying the same games from last time, and we still have a lot of that speculation. I'm working with people right now on loans in default uh, through, like family members got into trouble, put it this way, in an heir type situation where, they were supposed to inherit the home. But these things have been in extended pretend since 2006, 2007. I mean, we never played that crisis fully out either. There have just been programs since that time to keep those things in an extend and pretend situation, but you're starting to see judgments get entered. You're starting to see these get listed for sale. So I fully believe we're actually about to play out the last crisis. And what happened is you just brought in a whole new swath of those 30-year-olds that know everything, investors, that got a brochure that said this new home was going to be next to this great school, and they never visited to see that there were 1,000 homes, new homes all right there. So they likely wouldn't be able to rent that thing out. And this is what happened. People bought sight unseen and they did no due diligence. And so it all happened again, despite my feeling when I started my research that that surely could not be the case. So it's wild to actually see. But any go
One thing
ahead,
that I was gonna
John.
say about which makes housing different is you can get leverage on a house like nothing else.
Right,
If you have $1, you can and in stocks, you can use that as a loan to buy one more stock. But in
right,
housing, you put $1 down, you can get four more dollars. So you
right.
can borrow four more dollars from it. So when interest rates fell, one, they can get great leverage. Home prices are increasing, so you can get this tiny leverage to own it. You're not making anything or providing a service. You're just making money from owning it, and that it increases. And at the same time, if interest rates are going down, your other investments may be not as good because
Right.
interest. So you get this huge. So that's why we're getting more and more instability. Is because that's just the way housing is. You can't change that. Um, well, you could adjust some of the stuff on adjusting mortgages would help, but that's
Yes.
really super complex.
Yeah.
It's a lot simpler to just get rid of all the tax breaks. What I call it the one tax code for single family homes. It's the same tax code if it doesn't that applies to investors and to homeowners. And if a tax break is only for investors, get rid of it. It has to apply to homeowners as well, or get rid of the tax break.
From your mouth to God's ears, John, because something has to be done. Like people have to be able to afford housing. That's just if they can't, things in a society get a little crazy, if you know what I mean. So I think it is in all of our best interests to find a way that first time home buyers can enter the market again. And it's
Yeah.
not going to be by giving them a $25,000 check. We've already done that. We have so
Yes.
many generous down payment assistance programs
Yeah.
out there that does not help. Yeah.
I
So,
got an idea on that front. It was done. Uh, there's a policy, a law that was proposed by some Democratic senators, but also something similar from AEI, Ed Pinto, which is a conservative think
yeah.
tank. And their idea was to basically subsidize a 20-year mortgage. So you're making the payment of a 30-year mortgage, but they're buying down the rate to make it a 20-year. So
Mhm.
you build equity twice as fast. But but when you do subsidies normally, it just allows prices to go up. So if
Mhm.
you're one of the first with this new program, you can get in and you end up that's great for you, but you end up driving up prices for people who buy later on. It doesn't help.
Right.
But in this case, you can't buy a more house. You're just shortening the mortgage. So your defaults will fall in half or more because you're building up
Mm.
equity so much faster, about twice as fast. So I thought that was cool that some liberals and conservatives kind of agree on using that subsidies instead of $25,000 for the
Right.
that you buy down the rate. Another thing I think
Right.
would be good to be portable mortgages, so you
Yeah,
wouldn't get
like
locked in so
assumable.
much.
Mhm. Yeah.
Like they do it in Canada, I think it's standard.
Mhm. Yeah, and with FHA, VA, we can kinda do that. They make it very difficult.
Really?
Yeah, like they're called mortgage assumptions, and FHA,
Oh,
VA, you can do those. But I think it would be helpful if Fannie Freddie figured that out as well. There's so many things. This is the thing. I'd have to look into that solution that you talked about. There's just so many little things that we could do that would make a huge difference. It's just that nobody has had the will to actually problem solve and sit down and talk about it. And I truly hope that that changes and that we all start talking about solutions, because housing cannot be a casino. It is shelter, and we are not serving our community, our basically our culture, our country, by making housing speculative. So I totally
Yeah,
agree with you on those tax cuts. But we're getting close to the end
yeah.
here, John. Before you tell me where people can find you, and I will definitely put all of your links,
Thank
including
you.
to your website and to X Twitter, in the show notes. I want to give you any last words that you want to say about Phoenix generally, or the housing market. Just the anything you'd like to say.
Okay, if you can find a solution where it doesn't hurt the people that already own homes, but helps people who are going to buy the first time home buyers, it's like, wow, that's the dilemma right now. And the transition is going to be the hard part, but it can be done. And there's another thing in the US we see a lot of. We never talk about other countries because there's a zillion other solutions in other countries, but
Yes.
the interest of the in the US is to just focus on us and don't look around for any other solution. We want to do the solution here. And a lot of the times, and I think you've mentioned this too, mortgage policy and housing policy is a way to boost the economy. It's not a way
Yes,
to boost homeownership. And
that's
if you
correct.
look historically, back into the 40s and 50s, that's it. There would be a recession, and suddenly they eased the mortgages. So they're not, and that ended up with 30-year mortgages. And a lot of countries still have 20-year mortgages.
Or
There's more.
7 years. Right. Yeah,
There's
exactly.
yeah. There's more countries that have 20-year mortgages in the OECD than have 30-year mortgages.
Right.
So anyway, it can be done. So I think there's a lot that can be. There's solutions are out there. We just got to decide we want them and get them done. And to talk about my stuff, you can. I wonder how many people I'm going to lose on my Twitter account since I'm talking against investor tax breaks. But my Twitter account is at John Wake, and then I have realestateDecoded.com is it's a website, but you can get the Substack from there. And locally for Arizona, I have one called Arizona Real Estate Notebook.com. So you can check that out as well. So leave comments there.
Well, hopefully you won't lose any followers. You'll you'll gain some, but I know the feeling, John. I mean, often I have to. There's a lot of division out there these days, and people can't. But, I think it's important that we're able to have dialogue about these things. And if someone disagrees, that they tell us why and give us a good reason, and obviously we can consider that. But it's just dialogue. So hopefully people will take it. Understanding you're just trying to come up with a solution for how our first time home buyers can afford housing again.
It
So
doesn't need to be so unstable.
that's right. That's right. Well,
Well,
John, this is
let's make
go ahead.
homeownership boring again.
I agree with that. I totally agree with that. That is that's what I said to Julia LaRoche. I was like, she's like, what would you want to be talking about with housing? I said, I wouldn't want to be talking about it.
Yes.
I don't want to talk about it. I want it to be boring. I want,
Yeah.
so
Talking about
um
working and the kids and whatever. Yeah.
yes. You know what? Maybe we should make some t-shirts, John. Make housing boring again. Okay. I like it. All right. Well, I cannot thank you enough for your time, and just thank you for your leadership as well out there on X Twitter, sharing that data. And of course, thank you for being a fellow data nerd. So, really appreciate you joining me today. And, folks, I will see you again soon and hope to be bringing more interviews like this. So, thank you so much, and see you again next time.
It's a total honor. Thank you.
Thank you, John.